Hello, everyone. My name is Corey Thornton, Senior Editor here at Open Minds, and welcome to today's Circle Executive Roundtable, Revenue Cycle Management Trends and Best Practices for 2024. Today, we feature Open Minds Senior Associates DeWitt and Wolfe. Before we get started, I have a couple housekeeping reminders. Your audio will be muted for today's briefing, but if you have any questions, please submit them in the question box located on the right side of your screen. If time permits, at the top of the hour, we will answer those questions. And finally, the slides and the recording for today's roundtable will be archived and available for elite members on the Open Minds website starting tomorrow. And with that, here's Dee and Ray.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to start out by just going through briefly the agenda. We're going to be talking about re-engineering, three sections: re-engineering revenue cycle management to maximize cash, revenue cycle best practices, specifically focused on key metrics, and then looking at revenue cycle trends now and looking toward the future as well. Our learning objectives today is focused on, understanding best practices in revenue cycle management, actions that CFOs can take to mitigate revenue cycle management threats in order to sustain financial or maintain financial sustainability, and then trends impacting revenue cycle management that will be important for consideration now and in the future. I'd like to introduce Wolfe. Ray is should be somebody you've already met in forums, including the CFO Roundtable and others. Ray is a colleague at Open Minds. He brings over 40 years experience to the health and human services sector. His expertise is very broad and very deep. That includes managed care, value-based reimbursements, financial analysis, merger and acquisition, performance improvement, and strategic planning, just to name a few. Ray had a 22-year tenure with Pittsburgh Mercy Health Systems in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh. Most recently there, he served as the organization's chief operating officer, overseeing all operating systems, strategic planning, and performance management. Ray earned his Juris Doctorate from West Virginia University School of Law and his bachelor degree from West Liberty University in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he graduated magna cum laude. Ray, it's great to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee. Pleasure to be with you today and to chat about this. This is probably one of my favorite topics over the last 2 or 3 years coming out of the COVID epidemic issues. And it is so because I think it's being overlooked at a time period when things are very critical. Can we move to the next slide? One, I think things now, compared to before, are much more volatile. We are much more aware of the fact that major changes can happen and they can do so abruptly. They can do so disruptively. And in that kind of atmosphere, we have to be ready. That has led to reviews that we've done, analysis we've done about the strength of corporations and the organizations we serve. And all of them seem to focus in on 4 areas of concern. First, we know whether an organization is trying to merge or open a new program or develop an integrated care structure or do any of those things that are necessary in our environment for long-term sustainability, that they're going to need cash reserves. The cost of opening those kinds of programs always happen faster than the revenue that those costs generate. You're looking at 60 and 90-day lags at best. And in that kind of structure, we watch very carefully for cash reserves. Diversified revenue is critically important because we know how impacted performance can be by one single payer with one single problem. There is no excuse in our environment for anything other than consistent, strong operating margins. And we have to maintain that. And we have to maintain that to develop the cash to reduce our long-term debt and give us additional flexibility. All of those elements that we look for to determine if an organization is flexible, if an organization is ready to move or nimble in its approach, really depend on revenue cycle increasing cash. It strengthens financial resilience, and it allows an organization to move ahead. So the question, why revenue cycle management? Why now when there are so many things on your plate, when we are addressing so many issues? Basically boils down to our margins are too thin for us to allow money to be lost internally by failures to bill or address the debt directly. Our entire structure may be dependent on some program changes, some new structures, and those may be dependent on borrowing, and that borrowing may well be dependent on whether or not we are gathering the kind of money we need out of our billing cycles. So revenue cycle isn't anymore the traditional clerical mathematic process of filling out the forms and mailing them. It is a critical element to what we're doing. Move ahead one slide. Well, I talked about the 4 domains and how important they are: liquidity, operating performance, leverage, and process efficiency. Liquidity is all about cash. Do you have what's currently in reserve to deal with current bills? All 3 factors we looked at are impacted by the level of cash. In terms of operating performance, net margin, what you intend to collect minus what you have spent, is fully dependent on the ability of the revenue cycle to deliver high optimized billing numbers. Even in leverage, when you're talking about the mortgaging capability of your assets, you're looking at asset to liability ratios where cash and accounts receivable that is collectible will have significant impact. And finally, it's just a good example of whether you're efficient or not to be able to say that a bill going out the door can generate cash returns in 45 days. So accounts receivable becomes critical in that process flow as well. So whether it is a consultant that you brought in to look at a specific project, or a banker, or some finance folks on your board, the role of cash in displaying your revenue structure correctly and providing the correct impression of your company is totally critical. Let's flip ahead. And we're facing some major challenges to that, particularly in the areas of commercial insurances. We're noticing more and more deductibles. We're noticing more and more co-payments. We're seeing a large shift from the coverage by the insurer or the third party to what the consumer pays. We know very well that most of the people that we serve, because of the nature of the disabilities they have, are going to have more trouble maintaining work and maintaining a good job, and more difficulty, therefore, paying bills. 68% of consumers failed to fully pay medical bills. That's a substantial increase over just a few years ago. It costs 4 times more to collect from a consumer than it does from an insurance company. Consumers raise the cash collection costs of the organization substantially. And people with organizations with high collection costs tend not to be among the high performers. So this shift to self-pay means that more and more hours of work may be spent on bills where the collection of them is questionable. To me, this is another indication why the flow to commercials, the flow to the government entities and MCOs has to be as solid as possible to offset those. It may be possible for an organization to increase its Medicaid collections or its MCO collections far in excess of what these new deductibles might mean and actually be able to not be drawn into the quicksand that exists in terms of cost versus collection, or the value of attempting collection that many organizations have reached. Next slide.
And Ray, if I may, before moving on, thinking about the Medicaid sector, historically, I think it's a fair comment to say that there are a substantial number of specialty provider organizations, if you will, that really haven't prioritized client collections or self-pays, particularly those that have been on cost reimbursements, which have been moving. Of course, the industry is moving away from that. So one of the things that we're learning now is that emphasis simply on those collections can be the difference between a positive or a negative margin itself.
Yeah.
Simply just in that sector alone.
And I think it emphasizes something, though, about the nature of the industry. My history is with a large organization whose work was primarily with the severe and persistent mentally ill and the intellectually disabled and the homeless. So when you looked at that grouping, there was nothing to collect. And so many of our folks may well be in that kind of mix as well. I think it really calls into question relationships with commercial insurers as well. I know that in many states, commercial insurance rates for therapy are at or lower than Medicaid. And in those kinds of states, you have to question at what point can you really afford to have a large percentage of that collection shifted to the patient, where collections are less likely. Even if you've done a review of your revenue cycle in the last 5 years, there's more than enough good reasons to continue to do it. There are a whole series of changes impacting the collection cycle, everything from regulatory oversight to these expanded needs for cash that we've talked about. The HIPAA and 837, I believe, have created opportunities for us to improve and automate our revenue cycle in new ways. But the Affordable Care Act and many other elements of it have added complexity that are impacting the way we do business and should impact our workflows. We talked about the growing financial responsibility of the patient with the rise of the high deductible health plan, and the importance of managing that correctly. And really, Dee, I believe you'll agree with me on this, that one of the key elements in managing that correctly is knowing the correct amount when the person first arrives. Being able, because of the knowledge of your plan and the ability of your system to get information to the front desk clerk, to have the information about what the patient portion might be long before the service is given.
Absolutely.
Technology advancements.
I was
Go
just
ahead, I'm sorry.
Absolutely, Ray. And I've seen both at the in consumer level, speaking for myself, and looking at it across the industry, there's you see more and more often now, and you're seeing it mostly led by hospital systems and physical healthcare, but they tend to lead the way. Where now, if it's anything beyond an office visit, they're actually calculating in advance what your payment will be, and then charging you in advance prior to the payment, prior to the visit. So I think those types of modalities with regards to how they're handling advanced payment is probably the future to a certain extent in at least the commercial side of our business.
Exactly. And another thing I'm beginning to see more and more of in the flow is the technology advancements. The ability now for technology, and in many cases AI, to contribute to the process in ways that change the nature of the jobs in the revenue cycle itself. fewer staff, required to do much more independent thinking and to manage more complex situations. The role of the standardized entry system is less important than it has ever been as a result of what we're seeing in technology. That alone might be a reason to sit down and begin to look at your cycle change. If you don't have good information now about what percentage you are collecting of the net amounts you bill, now is a good time to get it. Many people will find themselves at 80, 85, less than 90%. And you have to ask, are you showing a 10% or 15% profit? If not, your margin is being eaten by the fact that you can't collect it. Let's shift slides. This is basically how I envision the revenue cycle. It's a twisted and interesting little diagram, but it is cyclical. It starts and ends with the Revenue Cycle Continuous Improvement Committee. And this, I think, is an essential part of it, and I'll even talk about that before I talk about the normal flow. The Revenue Cycle Continuous Improvement Committee is made up of all of the people impacted and affected by this process. The intake worker, the registration clerk, the insurance verifier, some clinical representation that is involved with coding, a medical records department if you still indeed maintain medical records in that way. Some of the front-end billing structures and automation and determining where the mistake levels are. All of these elements are areas where people interact with people outside their department. Our organizations are typically very siloed. It is very easy to blame an error or a problem on someone in another department and then never move to address it. And this kind of fault throwing back and forth between departments really leads us nowhere. I think that you need to start with the basic continuous improvement methodology understanding that everybody's trying to do a good job and that we're all in this together. The intake area really bothers me the most because not only are there multiple people dealing with someone new and gathering enormous amounts of data, but they're doing it under time pressures to get things accomplished and done and pre-authorized prior to the actual session. So starting the client through intake, through claims processing, and then any rebillings or payment postings or renews and addressing of denials, following through those 3 steps will provide the organization with data coming out of the end about their denials, about their problems, about claims still stuck in the system, that will allow the Revenue Cycle Improvement Committee to begin to ask why, to begin to address those problems by making systemic changes rather than simply blaming another department for the effort. So providing all of those people who have a common goal to see they have a common goal and to contribute to it through a place where their voice can be heard rather than simply ignored provides a great opportunity for continuous improvement. Organizations that have implemented the Revenue Cycle Continuous Improvement Committee, frankly, are doing substantially better in redesign, in integrating technology, and in improving their collections percentages. Let's move ahead. So if this committee is to work, you have to adopt a certain number of CQI styled habits and procedures. Consistency of task and clarity of roles around documentation, making sure that clinical supervisors are on the same page as the CFO, on the same page as the registration clerk with regard to who should complete documentation and what should be in that documentation before it is passed to the next step. processes around maintaining the data flow and getting it consistent really depend on clarity of roles. When, for example, in the intake process, you may have 3 or 4 people who don't even speak to each other and maybe aren't in the same building as they process through that information. I think that documentation formats play a big role. Narrative documentations, flow charts, and visual maps. I love a swim lane chart to begin to show whose responsibility is where and where the handoffs occur. I have noticed over time that flow charts seem to have some benefit over other forms in being able to train new staff to assume positions more readily within the system and to understand the actual flow. The committee itself isn't to talk about who's good and who's bad, but to identify root causes, to find out why it is that a particular denial seems to happen from a particular site with a particular insurance, to have the information to ask that question and to begin to look at the whys of how it could occur. There's a root cause analysis piece that fits into that. There's a Lean and Six Sigma approach to planning, to doing, to studying, and to acting that I think play into it as well and lead us to a place where we can continuously improve our workflows without casting fault on any of our coworkers and begin to see success in the jobs we're doing in the revenue cycle flow. Next up. So what are the major reasons for denial? If you look across the board and you ask payers, and these are the primary ones that you will see. As you read this list, my bet is you're going to look at it and say, ah, yes, I know that. I have a couple of those. I have several of those. Pre-auths are always a problem for me. We never know when one is due. Filing deadlines may even be a problem as claims become lost in the system. Registration and insurance data, duplicate claim processing because of errors in the computer system, missing information and coding. When you look at that, what you see is that the failure of a bill often occurs well before the biller ever receives it for billing. The processes that brought the person into the system, the documentation and processes provided by the clinical work that person received were where the errors occurred that make the bill uncollectible. And thus the need for team, thus the need for a committee that brings all of those folks together. Simply knowing this information, knowing your top 5 reasons for denial, can make an enormous difference in your collection rate. And if any of you are running at 30%, $30 million in revenue, or $25 million in revenue, which is somewhat close to our midline, 1 percentage point change is $250,000 in cash, which I'm betting many of you would like to see tomorrow. So in that flow, managing denials then becomes the key source of what the revenue cycle committee would do.
Ray, just to mention a very concrete example regarding what you're talking about, and I venture to say some of the people that are with us today have lived this. We're seeing a lot more focus in today's world on chronic and acute complex individuals, particularly among the agencies that Open Minds is working with. One of the things that, I think some of it has to do with the shift away from cost reimbursement, particularly to other reimbursement models, but those duplicate claims. You know, many times we've got acute complex individuals, they do have more than one case management service in the course of a day. And preventing that denial when it's unnecessary can be handled at the coding stage. but
Yeah.
it's necessary to document it correctly, and it's necessary to code it correctly to prevent it from becoming considered a duplicate claim when it's really not. So
You mentioned an element that has me thinking, Dee, and I want to kind of explore it just for a second. Most healthcare has, for the last 50, 100 years, been operating in a fee-for-service world.
absolutely.
Most of the organizations we work with came to this 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and then only in a very limited way. And grants still represented the biggest portion of what they did. So we are relatively newcomers to the area of revenue management. A hospital that might have been doing this work for 100 years has had multiple opportunities to upgrade technology, to determine new areas to move ahead. But we're kind of new to this process and catching up as a result of the fact that this isn't the way we started business.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Let's move ahead one slide. Again, that's simply noting that the denial analysis is about identifying key issues. 837 billing is really a plus in this process because adjustment codes and unpaid codes, denial codes are all fairly well organized, even if they flow more than one or two to a claim. And they allow us the kind of data we need to do the analysis and tell us where we need to go. Let's move ahead with the next one. This is so rudimentary, I'm kind of almost embarrassed. But this is 3 axes under which you might want to see where your denials are occurring. Are they happening by service type? Is it missing authorizations or other areas broken down by payers? And the third one is broken down by clinician. So you have denials that may occur as the result of the actions of a payer, or denials that may occur as the actions of a clinician. Frankly, a good Power BI setup can let you sort through that and see all the possible combinations quickly and be able to really focus in on where the problem lies. Nothing is more troublesome to me than the efforts I went through as a CFO to get clinicians to sign and complete their documentation. And I would go to clinician meetings and complain and rail about the need for money to pay the paychecks and how important it was. When, as we began to get more data, what I realized was that I should have been talking face to face with about 4 clinicians rather than broadly to the entire group. That the vast majority of physicians were doing their work, and we really, with addressing 2, 3, 4, 5 individuals directly, could resolve the documentation issue. I felt foolish. I felt like I had embarrassed people for no good reason. And I think in part of that flow, the data helps us understand it. If the data tells us that only one payer has a specific problem with this, I'm going to approach that problem more directly with that payer and less in complaints about my staff and my administrative workers or about my clinicians, and begin to focus on why it is that the bill works so well for 5 payers and does not for 1. So this kind of data, even though this is very simplistic, and you can easily do far better, this kind of data really leads us in good places in terms of being able to kick off that revenue cycle committee work and develop good improvement. Next slide. This feels to me to be something we ought to be addressing. Many of us have moved to productivity incentives, hiring incentives, and trying to create methodologies that reward people for the work they're doing, but also address the fact that much of our salaries are not as competitive as they should be in an era when the workforce is very, very tight. Given that, I think performance-based kind of incentives make sense in a much broader area. How do we reward the performance of a biller or a registration clerk who is getting tremendous amounts of effort and who is collecting at a 90-95% rate? We're going to have the data to begin to reward people in the revenue cycle more effectively. I know of at least one person who is considering limiting incentives for therapists unless collections are above a certain level, because the idea of promoting productivity when the notes aren't done and the treatment plans are behind really does not make sense in terms of flow. But if this is going to be a team effort and we're going to create the concept of team with our revenue cycle, maybe some kind of joint reward makes sense for those who have been part of this flow. Next step. So the overview starts with the 4 key components: logical, clear workflows designed and flow charted or swim graphed out, good technology that supports and wraps itself around the staff as they complete each task, knowing that we have the talent in the right positions in our revenue cycle process, and developing an oversight committee with the right mental attitude about leading this flow. Final slide. So you create the team, you establish the goals that you hope to meet, you educate the staff, you define root causes, you redesign, and you automate. And then you start the process again. This kind of continuous flow, I think, will lead us to the place where we can be collecting 96, 97% of the money we bill. And in that area, profits will be increased and the stability and nimbleness of the organization will be substantially improved. Dee, I'm going to hand it back to you now. I appreciate the time.
Appreciate it, Ray. Thank you very much. Well, what we want to do now is we're going to really dive into that second component, establishing KPIs and goals, and really start talking about key metrics, best practices. So when we think about key metrics, benchmarking, and so forth, there's several areas: insurance verification, days in AR, aging, claims denial rates, claims follow-up. I don't want to talk from this slide because we want to dive a little bit deeper into each one of those. So thinking about net days in accounts receivable, the benchmark optimally, we'd really love to see 30 to 40 days. You'll see quoted 45 days or under quite a lot. And certainly the ideal would be everything under 50 days or less. But operating optimally, we're recommending now 30 to 45 days. Why is it important? It's a measure of speed in converting AR to cash. Ray mentioned appropriately earlier on the need for cash in today's industry landscape. It used to be, and I think I'm aging myself here, but it used to be that we would talk about having operating cash on hand of 90 days. We're going in and doing financial analyses and working with organizations where, to be quite blunt about it, we're recommending 150 to 180 days of cash on hand. Now, that may not be all operating cash in terms of day-to-day operations, but it's to cover a whole variety of issues that we're facing today as provider organizations. I'll give you a couple examples. Number one, we mentioned technology, and we'll be talking about it again in a few minutes, but the need to be able to invest in technology. And some of that investment is in cash, some of that investment is in payroll that's redirected towards the technology implementation, while some of that may be actually borrowed dollars as well in terms of the purchase of the technology itself. Even if there is borrowed dollars, there's still cash going out the door from cash on hand related to the technology piece. At the same time, there are other things that are happening as well. In today's workforce, I know of organizations that, for example, when they find a licensed clinician or a psychiatrist that they believe fits well into their organization, but they may not be able to justify that person today. And they go ahead and hire that person anyway, invest in them, knowing that there's going to be turnover. And so that's a use of cash now. That's an investment to maintain services, maintain cash flow and operations, and it increases the need for that cash. So these are the types of drivers, if you will, that are really feeding into the net days in accounts receivable. This is the formula for that. It's not calculus. It's your total accounts receivable on any given day over your average daily charges. So if you think about that, it's a gross figure, and it's one that you can apply to a clinician. Going back to those areas of focus that Ray was discussing, you could apply that to an individual clinician. You could apply that to a program. You could apply that to a payer, and look at your accounts receivable days in accounts receivable in a number of areas. One of the things that we do is we really look at the buckets that are in accounts receivable, and we're really talking about aging accounts receivable here. 30 days or less, or what we call current receivables, and then in 30-day increments, usually going up from there. Ideally, we'd like to see the majority of our receivable buckets being in the current 30 days or less. And the reason why we actually say 30 to 45 days on average in the slide before is because we assume that there'll be a smaller slice, a smaller pool that will drive up that average. But the vast majority, I'd say 80 to 90% or less, you really need to be expecting to be paid within 30 days. And there's a caveat to that as well that really makes it even more important to stay on top of monitoring your average days. And I would say monitoring by payer specifically. And that is what we're seeing in the commercial realm is that payers are starting to take longer to pay. So, and it's not a news story, but it's an ongoing story. And there's been increased discussion about the length of time for certain payers and that increasing over the last 18 to 24 months. So it's something that is actively being discussed now a little bit more than it was before. So a strong recommendation would be to monitor your aged receivables or your buckets, if you will, by payer, so that you can really keep an eye on what's happening from that perspective.
You know, Dee, one of the things that I have noticed in the aged receivable is that in investments and interest rates seem to have an impact on how some payers pay.
Absolutely.
As long as they are holding the money, if interest rates are not as high as they should be, they may want to hold them a bit longer. One of the things that scares me in the aged accounts receivable area is the over 180 days. And I think, frankly, almost 99% of that is usually uncollectible. And we really need to be sure that we are netting our AR appropriately. That 30 to 60 to 90-day period is highly collectible and can be worked. As you move on from that, you will see that your aging is producing less and less cash, and that they really are lost claims that you probably cannot collect. So there's a lot of good reason to keep this graphic under control and to keep it structured in those low day areas.
I agree, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole. We are time limited today, but that makes me think about something from a pure accounting standpoint. but it translates into real dollars. And that is, I think from an accounting standpoint, agencies should be prepared to write off everything when it hits 180 days. That's an accounting write-off, just to be very specific about it. That doesn't mean you don't stop the collection effort. So the collection effort can continue on that. You need to balance that against cost of collection versus not pursuing it at some point. But a write-off does not necessarily mean that you stop the collection process. If you are able to collect some of those 180-day and over write-offs, then that's new revenue, new money after the write-off has been made.
And that's often true in the consumer areas rather than in the insurances or Medicaid areas, where long-term payments are often seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes back to, that leads us actually into the next metric, and that's the cost to collect. How much does it cost you as an organization to actually turn your receivables into cash? The industry standard is 2 to 4%. I would venture to say that within the health and human services industry, it's probably in that range. I don't think that it would be outside of that range. The operational performance indicator, it actually reflects how efficient you are at collecting cash. Well, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm pausing and struggling a little bit because I'm afraid of going down a rabbit hole while I want to focus on the overall key metrics and make sure that we have time to do so. But cost to collect is a major component. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we think about some of the challenges that we're facing now and going forward, looking ahead a little bit. A lot of that has to do with our workforce and our knowledge base that plays into how efficiently we're able to do that. Your clean claims rates. This represents a portion of claims that do not require edits before submission. How clean are they when they come to the billing and claims department? So did intake do their job? Getting back to the areas that Ray was talking about on the front end of this conversation. Did intake do their job? Did the clinician, are there notes written in such a way that they can be coded properly? Is it coded properly? If there's more than one service, are there identifiers in the coding to tell the insurance company that is not a duplicate claim, for example? These are the types of things that go into that. The clean claim rate, our goal is 95% or higher. We'll quote 90% to 95% or higher, but 95% or higher is really considered to be the standard. Ray, any thoughts?
I think it's critically important if you're going to collect on the back end, if you're going to spend time on the 120, 150, 180-day-old claims, that as many as possible are paid right from the start so that those groupings are as small as possible. So clean claim rate, to me, is a great way to begin to constrict the flow of claims that actually get to denial work, to reprocessing, to follow-up collections. And it helps us focus our efforts and more to the front end.
And just taking that a little bit further, from a staffing standpoint, a very low clean rate can impact your claims and billing staffing because it takes away from actual focus on claim submittal. And so there's some very, very real issues there in terms of going back to thinking about cost as well. Bad debt. Bad debt calculation is bad debt expensed over total patient revenue. The industry standard, 2% or less. The whole idea behind this is you'll hear the term leakage associated with bad debt. You want to minimize and prevent revenue leakage. You don't want $100 in revenue to turn into $98 in revenue simply because of writing off bad debt. It's a metric that can lead you to looking at the various root causes that Ray discussed there earlier in terms of the overall management, revenue cycle management. Bad debt in and of itself is going to simply tell you that you need to actually go back and look. Is there going to be some bad debt? Yes, there will be. It's the amount of bad debt and trying to focus in on the standards and meet or exceed those that should be the initial goal. And then as you look at that bad debt, it's diving into what that is. And that bad debt actually becomes, I think, probably the starting place for the agenda for your revenue cycle committee. Would that be fair to say, Ray?
Yes, I think so.
Cash conversion. This gets back to, again, how many days does it take you to convert receivables to cash? This is an example of one that I just did for an organization within the last few months. And you can see here how they went up in 2022 and then came back down over 2023. I know the organization that was involved, and a lot of this had to do with in 2022, we were in the COVID pandemic, and specifically in 2022, that's when organizations were seeing the ultra high vacancy rates within their organizations on the service delivery side, and they were seeing them elsewhere too. And I know organizations, for example, that were put in the position of asking themselves, do I focus on documenting or do I focus on continuing services because I'm short-staffed? And the documenting got put to the back burner in some cases. It's not a justification for doing that. It's just a reality that a couple of years ago, a lot of organizations faced because of the extent of turnover. I know some organizations that had as much as a 50% vacancy factor in clinicians. So the bump in this case doesn't surprise me. However, thinking about revenue cycle metrics, cash conversion ratios are one of the key metrics, and we want to keep it at 95% or less. Any thoughts, Ray?
I like to see the graphic of cash conversion against accounts payable, and to use the same process you would use here with accounts receivable, except use your accounts payable. Graphing them together, you'll often see that you're paying bills a lot faster than you're collecting the money that was generated by that expense. And seeing those two together can help you potentially begin to adjust or to see the cash flow of your company a little differently. Just interesting graphic that I've looked at.
I'm familiar with that graphic, and I'm glad you brought that up. But I think it's a really also good way to, if you look at the graphic, and I know we're talking about this verbally, but if there's a large space in between revenue and payables on top, or payables is on the bottom rather, payables are being paid faster, then that's something to look into with your accounts payable manager. I know organizations that have accounts payable managers where they pay things as soon as they come in, not when they're due. The other thing is to look at how over time those lines relate to one another. And if you can envision it, thinking about two lines, if they start to diverge, that tells you that perhaps the organization is not controlling, for example, its expenses relative to its revenue as much as it should. So there are interesting things to talk about that. We'll follow that up in another roundtable, Ray. I think that's a great one.
Yeah.
Key metrics, patient revenue, net patient revenue. So Ideally, the benchmark here is 100%. What it is the goal is to collect at or above 95% of your total revenue. It's another way of discussing bad debt, total revenue, and how the two interrelate. The calculation is payment services cash collected divided by payment service revenue. It's just another perspective of really how one looks at the total percentage of cash collected.
It's interesting. It's an interesting one to look at in terms of payers, because I think what you'll tend to see is larger payers have a higher percentage of collection than smaller insurers. And it may lead you to rethink some of your contracts if you're not getting a large volume return from it, and if you're only collecting a much lower percentage from that insurer.
Absolutely. So overall, when we think about revenue cycle management and scoring your revenue cycle management, cash conversion, ideally 30 to 40 days, certainly below 50. Cost to collect, 2 to 4%. Clean claims, goal is 95% or higher. Bad debt expense, keeping that at the 2% or less range. And then thinking about cash collection as a percentage of your overall revenue. So those are the key metrics that we recommend and that we see in the industry. And taking that another step further, we thought we'd take a few minutes and discuss what are the trends that we're seeing with regards to revenue cycle and revenue cycle management going forward. Interestingly enough, there's some data that we have read that more than half of healthcare facilities in 2022 were unprofitable. So when we think about that, it really drives the thinking in terms of how can we squeeze those extra dollars out of the revenue cycle management on behalf of the organization overall. And it really falls into 5 categories: patient-centric revenue management, leveraging new and existing technologies, how to navigate the regulatory landscape, embracing value-based care models. You'll hear a lot of discussions about alternative methods of payment, and then future-proofing oneself as it relates to revenue cycle management, and particularly your billing and claims department. First trend, patient-centric revenue. For the sake of time, I'm going to be brief in this, and as Corey said, this will be available online for downloading for elite members. But improving patient engagement and improving patient in expectations are critical. Patient engagement, patients are having a larger and larger say in how we organize and structure our service delivery now. They want to be able to pay their bills, for example, with credit card. Now, this may not be the complex, acute 20% homeless population that Ray discussed earlier, but it may be some of those individuals that are within that population. It's certainly going to be individuals that are in more commercial populations overall. So how you address your billing statements, how you train your staff to interact with patients and communicate with them, and actually the patient's ability, the method by which they're able to communicate all become critical. The payment options become critical as well. Do you allow them to pay on credit card? Do you allow them to keep that credit card on file? For several organizations that may be online today that are primarily Medicaid-based payments or populations that you're serving, this may speak to a relatively few number of your patients. But I would venture to say that over time, that number will expand. cutting edge technologies in revenue cycle management. Ultimately, it's the impact of automation and AI. There are studies now that are looking at inefficiencies that can reduce, that can result in a 5% loss in revenues that you're trying to make up. Ray mentioned it earlier. If you're operating at a 10% deficit, what can you do within your revenue cycle management to address this? And Ray appropriately said a lot of the focus right now is on technology to help make that happen. Some of that is in automation. Some of that is, you'll hear robotic process automation. That could be posting payments, data entry across different systems. AI is being applied now in areas such as coding, looking at medical records and how how those are being coded. There's several different ways that AI and technology in general is being applied today, and it's becoming better actually each quarter with regards to their capabilities. This is actually a flow chart or a graphic that will show you where within the revenue cycle management that AI, automation, predictive analytics, and so forth can assist. And moving on, navigating the changing landscape. One of the things that's really important is understanding as a department and as an organization what the regulatory landscape is. There are a lot of changes, they're ongoing, and it requires investing in time and training both within the claims and billing department and cross-training across departments. And the challenge for that is that I have yet to see an organization this year that doesn't have a bandwidth issue, either at the executive team level or within departments. It's a combination of staffing and budgets, combined with the amount of information and activities that we're all faced with doing today. The rate of change is coming faster and faster. So with that in mind, how as a CFO one carves out time to make sure that there is ongoing and regular training and cross training is critical, in my opinion, with regards to maintaining the capability of operating your department within the existing rules and regulations, and actually being able to verbalize those to clients and staff, and being able to make sure that your workflows address those. The same holds true for cybersecurity, especially if you're in an organization that has populations that you're serving that are asking for more automated payments, asking for sensitive financial information in addition to sensitive clinical information being stored on your servers. We have 2 minutes left, and so I'm going very quickly. Embracing value-based care and its implications for revenue cycle management. That really gets into talking about timely access, first pass resolution. What are the percentage of patient inquiries that are resolved immediately and don't have to require multiple calls, multiple touches, if you will? We hear a lot, and we talk a lot about patient satisfaction scores and patient satisfaction, and you'll hear net promoter score being discussed. But I think for right now, suffice to say that when a patient or a client is asked whether or not they will recommend your organization to their friends and family, which is what that score is asking, I promise you that they will be thinking about their experience with your billing and collections department and with your intake folks, not just about the clinical service. And then lastly, future-proofing the practice. The labor shortage is all important. it's impacting not just the clinical side of the house, but it's impacting the billing and claims and the support side as well. It's acknowledged very clearly that there has been a very real brain drain, if you will, or knowledge drain within billing departments, organizations that have had 20, 30, 40-year tenured staff that are leaving, either because of burnout or frankly, one of the reasons, major reasons right now is retirement. And with the ongoing labor shortage, that's becoming an issue as we go out and recruit. So, how you actually address labor shortages starts at registration and goes through all the way to patient collections. It's not just a matter of replacing somebody who does claims. It's understanding the fact that all of the different steps within the organization are important to your claims management and taking a proactive approach at every step along the way, and acknowledging that there are essential steps before and after the submittal of the claims that will impact your revenue cycle management that are labor related and knowledge related. Ray, we're out of time, but do you have any final thoughts?
No, I want to just say that we appreciate everyone's time and want to respect that level. These slides will be available, and there's tons of material in this trend section that I think is worth reviewing. You'd probably do an entire seminar on this last grouping alone.
Agreed, and I wish that we had more time to delve into it in a more conversational mode and discuss them. But do emphasize, please reach out and download.
Thank you, guys. Dee, Ray, as always, this has been great. I want to thank everybody who joined us today, and I want to remind everybody, as Ray has pointed out, that the slides and the recording for this will be made available on the Open Minds website starting tomorrow. And if you would, you can join us next week, Thursday, August 1st at 1 p.m. for our next roundtable, Improving Performance and Productivity Through Technology, the Clinical and Support Options Case Study. You can register for that event or look at a full list of upcoming roundtables by visiting us at our roundtables page under the events tab at www.openminds.com. Dee, Ray, this has been great. Until next time, I hope everybody has a great weekend.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.